Today's podcast will feature 2 stories about drivers who left their route and then bad things happened. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Highway Crash, and it's about police officers who make a mind-blowing discovery along a forested highway in England. And the second and final story you'll hear is called Rumble, and it's about a strange series of events that started with an odd rumbling sound in a forest in Arizona. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please replace the Amazon Music follow button's maple syrup with brake fluid. Around 7:20 p.m. on the evening of December 11th, 2002, a police department in a rural English county called Surrey started receiving all these frantic emergency calls. Now, all of these calls were coming from drivers on a heavily trafficked highway called the A3, and they all were saying the same things. They had seen this totally reckless driver with super bright headlights that was weaving in and out of traffic and going at high speeds and nearly crashing into people. And then a couple of the callers said they actually saw this car go down the embankment off the side of the highway, and so it looked like they might have crashed. And so, of course, this police department, after getting all these calls, decided to send out a couple of officers to see what was going on. When the 2 officers got out to the A3 and began patrolling the area on the A3 where all these calls were saying they had seen this reckless driver, they didn't see the driver. They didn't see a wreck on the side of the road. They didn't see any signs of an accident. I mean, there was nothing there. Now, had only one person called in about this wild, reckless driver, at this point, the officers would have chalked this up to a mistake or even a prank. But so many people called in about this one particular reckless driver on the A3 that these 2 officers decided to just keep on looking and really see if they can figure out where this driver went. And so to this point, the 2 police officers had been just driving on the A3 to try to find this driver. And so they decided they would park their vehicle, get out, and walk on foot on the edge of the highway because there were these huge forests that lined either side of the A3. In fact, Surrey, the county in England where this was one of the most heavily forested areas in all of England. And so these forests on either side of the A3 were very dense. You could not see very far into them. And so these officers were thinking that it might be possible that this driver, if they were driving as recklessly as all the callers made it seem like, they could have veered off the highway, gone down the embankment, and then because they were going at such a high speed, they could have crashed their way into one of these forests and basically disappeared from view from the road. That in order to see this crash in the forest, you'd have to be basically in the forest. And so these 2 officers, they pulled over, they got out, and they began walking along the edge of the highway, staring into the forest, looking for a sign of a car wreck. And sure enough, after walking for a while, one of the officers spotted something deep in the woods that looked almost metallic or plastic. Whatever it wasn't supposed to be in the forest. And so the officers made their way into the tree line and began walking through all the trees. And as they got closer, they realized very clearly there was a car. There was a wreck in the forest. And so the 2 officers, they begin running towards the wreck. They're calling for backup on the radio. They get to this wreck in the middle of the forest, and they're on the driver's side, and they look inside the car, and there's no driver in the driver's seat, but they looked through the car to the passenger side, and they saw the front passenger door was wide open, and on the ground on the other side of the car was very clearly a body. And so the 2 police officers rushed around the car to get a better look at the body. And when they did, they couldn't believe what they were seeing. It didn't make any sense. Like, what was this? Now, to understand why these police officers were so caught off guard by what they were seeing, we need to go back 5 months to July 16th, 2002. On that night, a 21-year-old man named Christopher Brian Chandler finished up his beer at a pub in West London. And for reference, where this pub was located was about 1 hour north of that stretch of the A3 highway in Surrey where the car was found in the woods. This night, Christopher had gone to this pub with a close friend of his. This was meant to be a fun night out. But, as Chris is finishing up this beer, he began to feel really antsy because it turned out Christopher was actually wanted by police in London for robbery, and so he hated staying in one place for too long. And so the only people who even knew where Christopher was the friend he was with at the bar, and then also Christopher's brother. He knew he was at this particular pub. And so finally, Christopher got so anxious about being in this pub for too long that he told the friend he was with that he just wanted to leave. And so he said goodnight to his friend. The friend stayed at the pub, and Christopher left, got in his car, and began driving south. But Christopher never arrived at the place he was trying to go. He just sort of disappeared, and nobody heard from him again. Christopher's brother eventually would report Christopher missing, but remember, the brother knows Christopher is wanted for robbery, and so Christopher suddenly going on the lam and just disappearing for a while was kind of par for the course, and so the brother really didn't think this was a big deal. And also, the police felt the same way because they know Christopher is trying to elude them, and so it makes sense he would be missing. And so as a result, nobody really followed up on Christopher's missing person report. Everybody just kind of moved on. That is, until 5 months later, when all those drivers began calling into the police in Surrey about seeing this totally reckless driver careening down the A3, who eventually crashed into a ditch, and then those two officers, they went out to that stretch of A3, and sure enough, it was Christopher's car, and the body on the ground was Christopher. However, there was a problem. When the two police officers walked up on Christopher's car and saw it for the first time, they were struck by how old it looked, but it didn't really register with them why that would matter. It just stood out to them that this is a really, really old and rusted up car. But when they went around to look at the body on the ground, Christopher's body, they saw that his body was actually mostly a skeleton, which meant Christopher did not crash and die on this night, December 11th, 2002. Very likely, he crashed and died 5 months earlier, right around the time he disappeared. Now, the Surrey police, they say that this was all just one big coincidence, that the reckless driver that all these drivers were reporting that night on the A3 must have not crashed and actually just kind of got away, and then just by coincidence, when the police were searching that area of the A3 for the reckless driver, they happened upon Chris and his car. But remember, several of the drivers who called in that night about seeing this reckless driver on the A3, they specifically said they saw the car veer off the embankment and crash down below near the tree line. Like, this is a serious crash. Someone needs to get out here with an ambulance because probably someone's hurt. And then when the police got out and searched the exact area where this crash supposedly happened, they find Chris's car that had all the hallmarks of a car that was driving recklessly on the A3 that veered off and crashed into the woods. I mean, they found Chris and his car because of these calls, but it could not have been Chris. But what other car could it have been? As of today, we do not have a good explanation for how this happened, and so it's been dubbed the A3 Ghost Crash. The next and final story of today's episode is called Rumble. Late on the night of May 27th, 1995, a long-haul truck driver named Devin Williams pulled his gigantic refrigerated semi-truck into a truck stop in a city called Kingman, Arizona. After putting his truck in park, Devin reached over and grabbed his sleeping bag off the passenger seat and began to unroll it. Devin would normally get out and use the bathroom and brush his teeth before going to sleep for the night, but this night, Devin was so exhausted that instead of going in, he just unfurled that sleeping bag and then climbed behind the front two seats of his truck and got into what's called the sleeper cab, which is an area behind the front two seats in the cab where drivers can lay down and rest. Devin had been on the road for the last 4 days, basically non-stop, and all he wanted to do was just finish the stupid route and get back home to his wife, Mary Lou, and their 3 kids in the tiny town of Americus in Kansas. Devin hated being away from his family for long periods of time, which unfortunately was part of his job, being a long-haul truck driver, But they needed the money because he and his wife had just bought a new house and it was a total fixer-upper, and so they needed to do a whole bunch of repairs to turn that house into a home. And so, missing his family and just wishing he was done with this route, Devin laid in his sleeping bag in the sleeper cab trying to fall asleep, but he just couldn't. And unfortunately, as Devin knew, if he didn't sleep this night, then he would have to take another break later on this route to rest, because he couldn't just continue to drive with absolutely no sleep. And so taking an additional break that he was not prepping for could affect his ability to get home on time. It was Saturday night, and the strawberries and lettuce that Devin was hauling inside of his truck were due in Kansas City, Missouri, 1,300 miles away, on Monday morning. And so Devin began doing the math in his head. If he stopped a little while later to take another sleep break, would he still be able to cover those 1,300 miles by Monday? And he just wasn't sure. Everybody at the trucking company where Devin worked knew the 29-year-old as being very easygoing and good-natured. Trucking was very hard. People drove insanely long hours on very little sleep, and some people even took drugs to stay awake even longer to make sure they hit their deadlines. And so truckers have kind of earned the reputation of being very rough and tough people. And Devin certainly looked rough and tough. He was this big guy who wore cowboy hats, he had a big Fu Manchu mustache, he had tattoos. But in reality, despite how he looked, he was actually like a gentle giant. And really all he talked about were his kids, who he was totally devoted to. The only time anyone at this company saw Devin get mad was when his work interfered with his ability to see his family. And now, as Devin tossed and turned inside of his sleeper cab, he was getting mad because he was thinking this stupid route and his inability to sleep during this particular break was very likely going to interfere with seeing his family. And after an hour of Devin getting angrier and so not sleeping at all, he finally just gave up on sleep. He chucked his sleeping bag, he climbed out of the cab, and he headed into the truck stop, where he went to the bathroom, he got a bite to eat, and then he called his boss, and he told him that he had just made a stop in order to sleep, but he couldn't, and so he was just gonna hit the road again. But don't worry, even though I need another break in order to sleep, I will be in Kansas City on Monday morning with this delivery on time. After speaking to his boss, Devin left the truck stop, climbed back into his truck, he fired it up, and then before long, he was back on the highway, driving east. Devin's boss was a guy named Tom Wilson, and he didn't find anything unusual about this phone call he got from Devin. Maybe it was a little unusual that Devin was unable to sleep, and that he called his boss to say he was unable to sleep, but Devin sounded totally normal. And so that night, Tom was not worried at all that Devin would not make it to Kansas City by Monday morning. Devin was like one of his most reliable guys, and so if Devin said he was going to be there on Monday morning, even if he needed extra breaks along the way, then he would be there on Monday morning. But on Monday morning, the distribution center in Kansas City, Missouri, where Devin was supposed to go and drop off the lettuce and strawberries, called Tom Wilson and they said, "Hey, your driver's not here yet. What's going on?" Now, at first, Tom was actually really annoyed with the distribution center because he felt like, okay, the clock has just struck the deadline. Devin will likely arrive in the next few minutes and they're prematurely calling to complain. And so Tom communicated that to the distribution center and they said, okay, fine, we'll wait a little bit longer. But when almost an hour passed and still Devin had not shown up, the distribution center called Tom back and said, hey, he's not here. Now, after the second call, Tom totally changed his mindset and he was actually now worried about Devin. And so he apologized to the distribution center and said he would get in touch with Devin as soon as he could and figure out where their shipment was. But Tom couldn't just call Devin and ask where he was and what was going on because this was back in 1995. They didn't have cell phones. And so Tom basically just had to wait for Devin, who's out on the road somewhere, to stop somewhere and call Tom to tell Tom what's going on. And so all day Monday, Tom sat at his desk waiting for a call from Devin. And when he didn't get a call from Devin, Tom began calling his other drivers all over the country, asking them if maybe they had had some sort of interaction with Devin and knew where he was and why he had not made it to Kansas City on time. But none of the drivers had any idea what was going on with Devin. No one had spoken to him. Then, that evening, Tom got a call, but it was not from Devin, it was from Devin's wife, Mary Lou. And she was calling to say, "Where's Devin? He was supposed to be home by now, and he's not. I haven't heard from him in days. What's going on?" And at this, Tom suddenly thought, okay, we have a real problem here. And so when Tom explained to Mary Lou what was going on with Devin, how he had missed this deadline, Mary Lou panicked and immediately called the police. A little while later, a police officer in Americus, Kansas, arrived at Mary Lou's house to take down the missing person report. And after they did that, the deputy assured Mary Lou that very likely her husband would be found and he would be just fine. And so they explained to Mary Lou that what they would do is put out an alert to all the different police departments that fell kind of roughly along the route that Devin's truck had been on, and see if any of them had had some sort of interaction with Devin. You know, maybe he got into an accident, maybe his truck broke down and he was stranded somewhere, you know, maybe he was hospitalized, who knows? But very likely one of these police departments would know where Devin was. And sure enough, after this alert went out, the officer got a call back very quickly from a sheriff's department in a place called Coconino County, Arizona. Coconino County was located 200 miles to the east of Kingman, Arizona, which was where Devin had been on Saturday night but couldn't sleep and then called his boss to say he was going to hit the road again. But, interestingly, the sheriff's department in Coconino County made it very clear to the police officer in Americus, Kansas, that they had no idea where Devin was, but they definitely knew where his truck was. In fact, basically everybody in Coconino County knew where Devin's truck was. It was all anybody in that county was talking about. Because on Sunday, so the day before Devin was reported missing, somebody driving Devin's truck spent the entire day terrorizing hikers and campers inside of the Tonto National Forest in Coconino County. The Tonto National Forest, which is 600,000 acres of just rugged wilderness preserve, was nowhere near Devin's trucking route. In fact, it wasn't near any trucking route ever. It's like 20 miles off of the highway, and the roads in the forest are barely wide enough to support small cars going through, let alone a 48-foot long, massive 10-ton semi-truck like Devin was driving. But on Sunday morning, so roughly 8 hours after Devin had called his boss Tom, two hikers named Lynn and Jack Yarrington were in their tent inside of Tonto National Forest, just having a nice time. It's peaceful, it's quiet, and they're right near this dirt road that kind of bent around a corner. And suddenly, they began to hear a rumbling sound coming from one end of this road. And so they were in their tent, they unzipped it, they looked out, and at first, all they saw on the road coming in their direction was this huge cloud of dust and smoke. And then through the dust and smoke came Devin's humongous truck blazing down this road at practically full speed. And at first, Jack and Lynn are like, how is this truck even in the forest? How did it get here? How did it actually manage to drive to this point? And after Devin's truck whizzed past them and blazed off in the other direction out of sight, Lynn and Jack weren't scared or worried. They were just totally confused. And so they began speculating, like, well, maybe the driver got lost and they're trying to find a place to turn around or something. And sure enough, a couple of minutes later, they heard a rumbling sound and they saw another cloud of dust, and it was Devin's truck now coming back in the other direction on this same dirt road. And so Jack and Lynn, they kind of backed up behind their tent, and they watched as this truck blazed past them again, flying out the other direction. And so in some ways, that kind of confirmed to Lynn and Jack that yes, this driver, who's definitely driving recklessly at this point, has likely gotten lost, they've managed to turn around, and now they're heading back out to the highway, and that's all this was. And then all of a sudden, as they're kind of chatting about it and laughing about it, they hear the sound of the truck coming back again. And they look up, and sure enough, there's Devin's truck barreling down the road again. Except this time, Jack and Lynn, they looked where Devin's truck was going, and they saw there was a small sedan coming up the road in the opposite direction. So Devin and the sedan are going to collide, and because this road was actually on a turn, the driver of the sedan couldn't actually see the truck, and the driver of the truck, whether it was Devin or somebody else, couldn't see the sedan. And so both drivers are driving towards each other without realizing it. And so Jack and Lynn, they jump up, they begin screaming and yelling at the driver of the truck to slow down. But the truck didn't slow down. It just continued coming down the road. And the sedan driver, he saw Jack and Lynn flailing their arms and trying to get somebody to stop on the road. And so sensing there was another car, the sedan came to a full stop. And then right in front of them, they saw this truck come barreling around the road. And so the sedan began backing up wildly, trying to get out of the way of this huge truck. And then finally, the driver of the sedan just cut the wheel and peeled off the side of the road into the brush. And right as they did, the truck, which had not slowed down at all, even though the driver could have clearly seen the sedan, just whizzed right past the sedan and would have smashed into it if the sedan had not jumped off the road. The driver of the sedan got out of the car, and when Jack and Lynn ran up to him to make sure he was okay, he would tell them that he got a good look at the driver of the truck as he drove past him, and he told them that the driver was just gripping the wheel, looking totally straight ahead, no expression whatsoever, just barreling past him. It was like he didn't even look at the sedan. He was just going. A little later that day, and not far from where this incident had just happened on this road with Jack and Lynn and the sedan, there was this family that was hiking through Tonto National Forest, and they had arrived at this big, beautiful open field in the middle of the forest, and they planned to have a picnic in this field. But as they came out of the tree line and walked into this beautiful open high grass meadow area, they looked out and they saw just kind of in the middle of the field was this huge truck that made no sense. How in the world could this truck have gotten to this meadow? They didn't know. But they clearly saw there's a truck, and the father of the family, he saw there was a man standing next to this truck, just kind of looking away from them off at the mountains in the distance. And so this family kind of assumed that the driver of this truck had somehow gotten into this meadow and maybe their truck was stuck and so now they need help. And so the father told his family to stay put for a second, and then he, on his own, walked across the meadow towards this truck. And as the father got closer, he did see that very clearly the truck was stuck in the mud. And so this driver very likely is stranded. And so as he got close enough, the father yelled out to this guy and said, "Hey, do you need some help? We can go back and call someone. What can we do for you?" But the man who was standing outside of the truck didn't even turn around to talk to this father. He just kept standing there motionless, looking off into the distance. And so the father made it about 5 or 6 feet away from this guy, and the father just stopped and very clearly said, "Hey, I'm talking to you. Do you need help?" And at this point, the man who was standing next to the truck, he turned around and he looked at the father. And immediately the father kind of backed up for a second because there was something off about this guy. The guy was just kind of standing there and he was staring at the father, and he opened his mouth like he was about to speak. But instead of speaking, he just kept opening his mouth wider and wider until it was as wide as he could get it. And then he began wiggling his lower jaw back and forth as fast as he could, and then clicking his teeth simultaneously. And so the father just began backing up like there was something wrong with this guy. And right as the father was about to just turn around and leave and go protect his family from this guy, the guy stopped with his mouth, and then he just stared directly at the father and said very calmly, "I didn't do it. They did it." Now, when the father heard this, he was already so weirded out by this guy that he didn't even have any questions to follow up with. Instead, he just turned and began running back towards his family. And so feeling very unsettled, the family, they ran back to their car, they drove back home, and they called the police about this guy and his truck. It would take a deputy from the Coconino County Sheriff's Department a little while to finally navigate their way all the way out to this meadow where this truck and this guy apparently were. And when the deputy got there, they walked out into this meadow, and sure enough, just like the father had said, there was the truck stuck in the mud. And so the deputy began walking out to the truck, expecting to see the driver, this guy who the father had said was acting totally weird. But when the deputy got up there, he found the truck was totally abandoned. There was nobody in the cab, there was nobody nearby, it was just sitting here, but it was still running. And so the deputy tried to open up the cab, but it was locked. He did look inside, and everything looked very neat and orderly. And then he went around to the back of the truck, and he opened up the back doors, and he found the refrigeration unit was still on, and inside of this truck was lots and lots of strawberries and lettuce. So the deputy really didn't know what to make of this truck in the middle of the field, combined with this report that the father gave about this guy who was standing near it, acting totally weird. And so he just checked the license plate of the truck and he ran it against his database to see if there were any matching reports of missing trucks or missing truck drivers, but there weren't any. Because remember, this is on Sunday this is happening, and it wasn't until the next day, Monday, that Devin was reported missing and his truck was added to a list of missing trucks and missing truck drivers. And so the Coconino County deputy just called a towing company who came out and hauled Devin's truck out of the forest. And then 24 hours later, when Devin was reported missing, the Coconino County Sheriff's Department put it all together and contacted the officer in Americus, Kansas to say, okay, we do have Devin's truck, but we don't have any other answers for you. The behavior of the man who was driving Devin's truck through Tonto National Forest was so insanely out of character for someone like Devin that it seemed totally impossible that Devin could have done this. But both Lynn and Jack Yarrington and the other people who saw this truck flying through the forest on that Sunday, they all insisted that the man they saw in the cab driving this truck matched the picture of Devin Williams. But there was absolutely no reason for why Devin would want to go to the Tonto National Forest. And even if he did want to go to this forest for some reason, he should have known that his massive semi-trailer truck was not a good choice to be driving around these narrow dirt roads in the middle of this wilderness preserve. All we know about Devin is that at the time he went missing, all he likely wanted to do was just get home to Americus, Kansas to be with his wife and 3 kids again. That's really all he cared about. The police did consider that, maybe Devin just ran away, but that theory didn't add up. Devin had no criminal record, he had a great relationship with his wife, so there were no issues there, and there were no other kind of outstanding relationship issues with friends or family, and financially, even though it was a little tight, they were doing just fine. They just wanted some extra money to fix up this house and make it really nice. It wasn't like they were struggling to put food on the table. Also, the police considered that, maybe Devin was kidnapped or something. But Devin is like this big, imposing, tattooed cowboy hat, big mustache, tough truck driver. I mean, who's gonna try to kidnap that guy? Devin also had no medical issues. He wasn't struggling with his mental health. He had no neurological abnormalities. He also never used drugs and always passed every single drug test that he got while working for this trucking company. Devin was basically just this totally normal, nice, well-adjusted guy with nothing to run or hide from. And so none of this made any sense. Police mounted a massive search inside of Tonto National Forest, and during this search, the couple, Jack and Lynn Yarrington, who had seen the truck barreling up and down the road and nearly collide with that sedan, they would tell searchers that they actually thought they saw Devin Williams, not in his truck, but out on foot, walking around on Monday morning, so just hours before he would have been reported missing. They said they just saw this guy wandering barefoot down the road as they were driving out of the forest, and they slowed down to ask him if he was okay, and this guy, who looked exactly like Devin Williams, responded by picking up a rock and throwing it at their car. And so Jack and Lynn just drove past him, not realizing that this was the guy who very likely was driving that truck. Now, the police, when they began this search, were pretty confident they would find Devin, especially after hearing from Jack and Lynn that he was pretty likely on foot and without shoes walking around the forest. It seemed like he could not get very far. But despite this huge search, they could not find Devin. There was absolutely no trace of him. And so, after nearly 3 weeks of searching and not finding Devin, the police called off the search. Then, on May 2nd, 1997, so almost exactly 2 years from when Devin had been reported missing, 2 hikers were walking on this trail in the middle of Tonto National Forest, right in the area where police had extensively searched for Devin 2 years earlier. These 2 hikers, they're walking on this trail, and up ahead they see there's this white thing right in the middle of the trail, just kind of sitting out. Now, this is a well-trafficked trail, and so they're wondering, what is this thing? And so they walk up and they see this white thing is a perfectly intact human skull. There's no skeleton, it's just the skull. And so these hikers, they gasp, they can't believe they're looking at a real human head, and they're thinking, how in the world did it get here? Why hasn't anybody else seen this and taken it? Like, how are we the first ones to see this? And so they would end up calling the police would come out, they'd gather up the skull, it would be sent in for testing, and sure enough, DNA testing would reveal the skull belonged to Devin Williams. No one has ever been able to explain what actually happened to Devin Williams, but the discovery of his skull inside of Tonto National Forest nearly guarantees that the driver of the truck 2 years earlier really was Devin, and the guy standing outside of the truck that was stuck in the mud in the meadow was likely Devin, and the guy throwing rocks at Jack and Lynn's car was Devin. People have put forth a whole host of theories about what happened to Devin, ranging from he had some sort of medical event where he kind of lost his mind and that's what caused all this strange behavior, or maybe Devin was on drugs despite not having any history of drug use. Maybe he took a really strong drug and that's what caused him to do all this. And still others believe that maybe there's a paranormal element to this whole story, that perhaps Devin was contacted by aliens, and that's what induced all the bizarre behavior, and then ultimately he was abducted by said aliens, and then somehow his skull wound up back on this trail in the middle of Tonto National Forest. And as crazy as that sounds, still to this day, no one has any idea what happened to him, so that theory is just as good. On the morning of February 4th, 1991, a taxicab driver named Wang was chatting with the taxi dispatcher at headquarters when suddenly, for no clear reason, the dispatcher stopped talking to Wang and just began staring intently at something behind Wang. And so Wang noticed this, and right away he turned around to see what it was he was looking at, but all Wang could see was just a window that looked out to this huge fenced-in parking lot that was full of taxicabs and their drivers. This is where they would go to wait for fares. And where the taxi headquarters were located was right near the airport in a very busy city called Kaohsiung City in Taiwan, and so taxi cabs in this area were really in high demand. And so as Wang looked out at the very busy parking lot full of drivers talking to potential customers, to Wang, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. It was just a typical busy day. But when Wang kind of looked at the dispatcher like, I don't really see what you see, the dispatcher just raised his finger and kind of pointed in the direction that he was staring. And so Wang turned around again, and this time, when he looked in the direction the dispatcher was pointing, he could see immediately why the dispatcher was reacting the way he was. Because the dispatcher was pointing at one of their colleagues, so another taxi driver, whose name was Leo Shui Chung, and as Wang looked out at him, he saw Leo was sprinting across this very busy parking lot full of all these cabs and drivers and customers, and Leo was clutching this big golden statue of Buddha in his arms as he ran. And so Wang and the dispatcher watched Leo, and what he did is he kept running all the way across the lot until he got to his taxi cab, at which point he practically dove inside of it, he slammed the door, locked every door, and then began looking around frantically like he was expecting someone to show up who had been chasing him or something. But there was nobody around his car, and Wang and the dispatcher kind of scanned the parking lot, and they didn't see anybody who seemed remotely interested in Leo. And so Wang and the dispatcher continued to watch Leo from the window, and they saw eventually Leo stopped kind of scanning around for other people, and at that point he took that golden statue of Buddha and he placed it up on the dash of his cab. And this was not the first Buddha statue that he had put up there. From Wang and the dispatcher's perspective, it looked like he had at least 2 or 3 that were right up there alongside this new one. And then after Leo placed this new golden statue, he sort of sat back in his chair, and from Wang and the dispatcher's perspective, it sort of looked like he had closed his eyes and was praying or mumbling something, but, whatever he was doing, it just seemed kind of odd. And so eventually, Wang and the dispatcher stopped watching Leo, who still just continued to sit back in his chair and, mumble or pray or something. And then Wang and the dispatcher looked at each other and they exchanged very concerned looks. Because they both knew, Leo was kind of a weird guy, but from his behavior today, it just seemed like, something must be wrong with Leo. There has to be some issue. So, for context, Leo was this 35-year-old guy who lived alone, and he had this reputation of being very antisocial and kind of just rude, like he had terrible manners. But recently, Wang and the dispatcher and other taxi drivers who worked at this company had noticed that Leo's behavior had gone from being kind of awkward and antisocial to being kind of menacing. Like, not even including the weird behavior he was exhibiting now, just like in his day-to-day interactions with people, he was just really aggressive. Like, he always would tell his colleagues at the taxi company how much he hated stray cats and dogs. And, a lot of people found these stray cats and dogs in their neighborhood in the city to be a bit of a nuisance. They'd rummage through trash and make noise or whatever, but nobody really paid them much attention. They were just stray animals trying to survive. Like, it wasn't a big deal. But for Leo, he obsessed over hating the stray cats and dogs and how much he wanted them to get out of his neighborhood. And somewhat recently, he had come to work and told his colleagues that he had gone out and gotten a crossbow, and at night he'd begun shooting at the stray cats and dogs, which totally horrified his colleagues. And now Leo had this weird thing going on with his Buddha statues that he was putting inside of his cab. And also, in addition to those statues, he had begun putting on the windows inside of his cab these things called fulus, which are these little strips of yellow parchment paper that basically ward off evil spirits. And so Leo had basically transformed the interior of his cab into this sort of weird shrine or temple. And in fact, Leo had put up so many of these fulus on the inside of the windows, and again, all those statues that sat on the dash, that when he drove, he could barely see because his view was totally obstructed. But despite everybody at the company seeing this totally weird behavior playing out with Leo, nobody went up to him and said, "Hey, what are you doing with these statues and pieces of paper? What's going on here?" Because nobody wanted to interact with him. He seemed like kind of a menace, and so people just kind of let him do his thing. But now, as Wang and the dispatcher are watching Leo run across the lot and act totally psychotic, they looked at each other and they were like, maybe we should do something. And so Wang volunteered to call the police, and as Wang turned to go walk out and make the call, he saw Leo peeling out of the parking lot, nearly smashing into cars and people, just driving like a total maniac. And so Leo really felt like, okay, yeah, this really is the time to step in. Someone's gonna get hurt here. The following day, Wang would contact his friend in the police department, and he would explain what was going on with Leo. And to Wang's surprise, his friend told him that actually the police were well aware of Leo. And that was because not all that long ago, Leo was actually a suspect in a murder case. So about 10 months earlier, in April of 1990, a 23-year-old woman from Japan named Mariko Iguchi had visited Taiwan on vacation, and during this vacation, she had gone missing. Now, at the time, the Taiwanese economy really relied heavily on Japanese tourism, and so Taiwan really aggressively marketed to Japan to, come visit, come on vacation here. And so it was pretty common for Japanese college students to visit Taiwan on vacation to celebrate things like a graduation or a birthday party. And so that's what Mariko was doing. She was here celebrating, and she was traveling alone. Also, one sort of quirky thing about Taiwanese culture at the time was it was pretty common for taxi cab drivers to open up their own personal homes to their fares, basically saying, hey, don't stay at a hotel. I'll give you a ride wherever you're going to go, but then at night you can stay at my house with my family. And so it was just kind of a thing in Taiwan that people visited and stayed at the homes of their taxi cab drivers. So when Mariko came to Taiwan on this vacation, this is what she did. She stayed in the home of the taxi cab driver, and it was during this period of time that she went missing. And so naturally, when the investigation began into her disappearance, the first place police went were the taxi cab drivers. And so first, the police focused on a driver in the capital of Taiwan who said he had given Mariko a few rides, he had brought her sightseeing, and then he had let her stay in his home. But he said, after that, she left and he didn't see her again. He had no idea what happened to her. And the police would actually discover that after Mariko left that particular driver's house, she would send a postcard to her family that was dated after she had left. And so basically this ruled out the first driver as a suspect. And so for a little while, this case went cold because the police couldn't find any other taxi cab drivers that had given Mariko a ride. But then, a few months later, the police offered a reward for information about what happened to Mariko, and it was then that police got a tip that Mariko had been seen speaking to Leo at the train station before she disappeared. But when police spoke to Leo, he immediately said, yes, I did give Mariko a ride, but that was it. She didn't stay at my house. It was just this one ride from the train station into town. And, after she got out, I have no idea what happened to her. And so police would ask Leo dozens more questions and they would try to get more information from him, but he just didn't have any. And then at the same time, there was this flood of all these new tips that began coming into the police station about this case. But it would turn out a lot of these leads, like all of them, were just terrible tips. People were calling in totally random stuff just because now there was this monetary reward for information, and it was kind of incentivizing people to just call in anything, and it was actually making the investigation much harder because now the police had all these bad tips, and so they really weren't getting anywhere. But despite the slow progress the police were making in this case had really been elevated and become like a huge international news story, and lots of people all over the world were following it. And during this time, when all these people are tuned in to this case, really weird things began happening surrounding this case. People in the city began receiving all these strange phone calls from this kind of frantic woman speaking Japanese. And in Taiwan, people predominantly speak Taiwanese and Mandarin, not Japanese. So this is a weird phone call to be getting in Taiwan. And also, at this time, you need to remember that Mariko's disappearance was kind of all over the news. And so to get these weird calls from a woman speaking Japanese who sounds totally frantic, it made people in the city believe that it was Mariko placing these strange phone calls. But these calls, they didn't make any sense. It was just a woman kind of yelling in Japanese, and then she would just abruptly hang up. And also, there were all these reports of people claiming to have seen Mariko or heard Mariko just in the city walking around. None of it was substantiated, but there was just kind of this eerie quality to the case. And so when Wang called his friend at the police department to report Leo for his totally weird behavior, this was at a time when the Mariko missing person case was still totally front of mind in Taiwan and around the world, and also the police were still actively investigating this case, and frankly, Leo had not been ruled out as a suspect in this case. He was not considered a primary suspect by any means, but he wasn't ruled out yet. And so the police are hearing that Leo's acting really funny, and it made them think, hey, maybe we should reinvestigate this guy and see if he really is connected to the Mariko missing person case. And so ultimately, after Wang hung up, his friend in the police department got in touch with the lead detective on the Mariko case and told him about what was going on with Leo. And this lead detective, whose name was Lin Xiaoji, decided he would just put Leo under surveillance to see what he was doing. Starting sometime in the middle of February of 1991, Detective Lin and a few of his colleagues began taking turns trailing Leo basically 24/7. And so the police just kept their distance and they followed Leo all around the city as he picked up his fares. And, the police never got out to talk to any of the fares, to get insights into whatever Leo might have been saying inside the cab. They just kind of watched from a distance and just wanted to see if there was any obvious red flags. Detective Lin figured, if Leo was somehow involved in whatever happened to Mariko, let's say she was killed, and let's say Leo was responsible for killing her, maybe if they followed Leo long enough, he might drive to an area that was kind of connected to her murder. Maybe her gravesite or the place where he killed her or something. Going to kind of strange random locations without a fare would likely be an indication to police that that was a place of interest. But as the police tailed Leo, that's not what he did. Leo basically never ever left his cab. Leo basically just picked up a passenger, drove them where they needed to go, and then repeated over and over and over again all day long. And then at the end of the night, instead of going home to his apartment that police knew he had, he would just sleep inside of his cab, just like in parking lots and stuff. And the only times he would go into his apartment appeared to be just so he could go to the bathroom or maybe shower or something because they would see him through the window. But whenever Leo went into his apartment, he went through the same totally weird ritual every time. He would be in his cab, parked out front of his apartment, and the police are, parked far enough away that they can watch this. And Leo, at some point, would begin kind of frantically looking all around him, as if he was looking for somebody who was trying to hurt him or who was spying on him or something. And then after kind of making sure the coast was clear, Leo would open up his door and sprint, like absolutely as fast as he could, into his apartment building, and he'd only be in there for like a couple of minutes before he'd come bombing back out and practically dive into his cab, and he would shut all the doors, lock all the doors, and then, he'd clutch his golden statues, and he'd rub his fulus that were taped all over the inside of his cab, and he'd continue frantically looking around, to make sure nobody was there to hurt him or something. And then after a little while, he'd kind of calm down, he'd put his statue back on the dash, he'd kind of make sure his fulus were all in place, and then he would drive away. So, of course, Leo's behavior, from the police's perspective, was totally bizarre, but in Detective Lin's mind, it didn't really seem like the behavior of a murderer. It seemed more like the behavior of someone who had lost their mind. Finally, on March 4th, 1991, Detective Lin decided that he just needed to speak to Leo, which required, basically ambushing Leo. So Detective Lin coordinated with his officers who were out surveilling Leo, and he had them tell him when Leo was at his apartment, going in to use the bathroom. And when they called in to Detective Lin that, hey, he just got to his apartment, he's about to run inside, Detective Lin and some other officers raced to the apartment, and they were all ready outside for whenever Leo came running back out to dive back into his cab. They were going to intercept him. And now Detective Lin and his colleagues didn't really know how Leo was going to react to having all these police standing there ready to grab him. I mean, was this guy going to be hostile? Was he going to be aggressive? Was he going to be scared, sad? They had no idea. It just seemed like Leo was totally unstable, so they all kind of had to be ready for whatever reaction he was going to have. However, the way Leo ultimately reacted to this was not the way any of the officers suspected. When Leo came bombing out of his apartment after a very short bathroom break, he began charging down the stairs towards his cab, and then seemed to kind of realize there were all these detectives and police officers all standing in front of him, literally getting ready to grab him, and Leo just collapsed to his knees and began sobbing and thanking them over and over and over again. Now, Detective Lin had no idea what this was. He didn't really understand what Leo was thanking them for, but he didn't waste any time trying to figure out what was going on. Instead, Detective Lin just went up to Leo and said, hey, we need to speak to you at the station. Will you come with us? And Leo was like, of course I will. Of course I will. And so Detective Lin drove Leo to the police station, and when they got there, Leo was saying things like, oh, I wish I could just stay at the police station with you all. Like, this is where I'm safe. I want to stay here. Now, Lin didn't really respond to this. He just kind of said, okay, yeah. And then they went inside together to head towards the interview room. And as they're walking there, Leo was saying over and over again to Detective Lin and any of the officers he passes by, thank you so much. You're my savior. Thank you. Now, the police had no idea why Leo was treating them like his saviors, because to them, they're like, dude, we just ambushed you and brought you to the police station to question you about potentially being involved in a murder, so I don't know how we saved you. But it would turn out Leo had a really compelling reason to believe they really had just saved him. Because it would turn out Leo had this absolutely terrifying thing happening inside of his apartment. Just several minutes earlier, when Leo had run into his apartment, so right before he charged back outside and police grabbed him and took him to the station, when he was still inside of his apartment, he stepped inside and the apartment was totally dark. All the lights are off, all the shades are drawn, and immediately Leo felt his heart starting to race. And he looked around his apartment and it was totally silent, but then he heard it. He could hear on the far side of his apartment in a room that he couldn't quite see into the sound of breathing. But Leo lives alone. There shouldn't be anybody here. He has no pets, there's nobody here, but he hears breathing in another room. But Leo knew there was nothing he could do. The only thing he could do was just try to get in there, go to the bathroom, and get out as quickly as possible. And so very slowly, Leao began kind of tiptoeing across the living room floor, kind of making sure to stay out of eyesight of the doorway that led into the room where the breathing was coming from. And as soon as he kind of got past an area where he could be seen from the doorway, he ran the rest of the way down the hallway. He cut into the bathroom and shut the door and locked it. And then as quickly as he could, he did his business. He used a washcloth to clean himself because he didn't have time to take a shower because of what was going on inside of his apartment. And then once he was all done, he took a deep breath, and then he opened up the door. And this time, the apartment was absolutely silent. There was no more breathing. And so Leao, thinking he had this opportunity to get out of here without being caught by this thing inside of his apartment, he turned and just started running towards the door. And as soon as he did, he began to hear a voice, a hoarse female voice, screaming at him from the other side of his apartment, screeching, "Why? Why? Why?" And as Leao is just about to get to the door, he turns and he sees Mariko, the missing woman, running with her hair all knotted and matted hanging over her face, sprinting towards him from that back room. And Leao, he only managed to barely get out of his apartment and shut it and lock it before she ran into the door. And then it went silent again. This is why Leao was acting totally crazy, because he was terrified of what he believed was like this demonic entity inside of his apartment. He didn't think that was a real person. He thought it was like the spirit of Mariko or something, and she was haunting him. And so he had no idea what to do, he didn't know who to tell, and he just began living out of his cab instead of dealing with whatever was going on in his apartment. And so when Leao charged outside after this latest encounter with Mariko, he sees the police, and Leao is just overwhelmed with relief. Hopefully, he's thinking they can get rid of her and his life can go back to normal. But as overjoyed as Leao appeared to be, and now having the police on his side, finally being able to deal with whatever was going on, when push came to shove, Leao actually did not feel comfortable immediately giving up details of whatever was going on with Mariko inside of his apartment. But as Leao was brought by Detective Lin to the police station to tell them what was going on with how Mariko was in his apartment and she was haunting him, it seemed like it was the ghost of her or something. As Leao was having that conversation, other police officers were sent to Leao's apartment to go see if maybe Mariko really was in his apartment. Maybe that's where she had been this whole time. Maybe she broke into this guy's apartment and was just squatting there and harassing him, and that was the mystery. That's where she's been. But when police went into Leao's apartment, there was no sign whatsoever that anybody else besides Leao was living in that apartment. There was no sign of a break-in. There was nothing. It was just Leao's apartment. And so this made police really suspicious of Leao because his story was so outrageous, and also he's talking about a person who's actively missing, Mariko. And so the police really pressured Leao to, come forward, give us more information. Why did you say this is Mariko in your apartment? Because there's nobody in your apartment. Tell us what's going on here. And so finally, after 4 days of intense questioning of Leao, Leao did finally admit to police that there was more to this story. It would turn out Leao really did pick Mariko up at the train station when she arrived in Taiwan for her vacation. So he did give her a ride, just like he said he had. But Leao had lied about what happened after that. It would turn out, after giving her this ride, Leao stayed with Mariko and they went sightseeing together, and then Leao invited Mariko to stay with him at his apartment, which again was customary in Taiwan. And so Mariko said yes, and she went to his apartment in the evening, and while they were there, Leao did proposition Mariko, and she rejected him. And at first, Leao just let it go, but then after Mariko fell asleep that night, he got his crossbow that he used to shoot dogs and cats, and he went into her room and he shot her 4 times with the crossbow, and then cut her head off. Leao would bury her body the following night, but that same night was the first time Leao began hearing the breathing in his apartment. He couldn't quite place it, and then, not long after that, the head of Mariko, the severed head, would chase him all around his apartment, screaming, why, at him. And so basically, Mariko's severed head began haunting Leao incessantly to the point where he moved into his taxi cab and put up all those Fulu papers to protect him from evil spirits, and also put up all those statues of Buddha for the same reason. I mean, he was living in his cab to protect himself from what he believed was this evil spirit. And so when people saw Leao in his cab kind of sitting back and muttering to himself, that was him praying that he would live through whatever was going on with this head. Leao would tell police where he buried Mariko's body, and he would tell police he buried her entire body in one location, including her head. But when police dug her up, it was only her lower half. Her head was missing. Leao was convicted of murder, and to this day, he is still in prison. Many people in Taiwan believe that, this case was ultimately solved because of Mariko's spirit, that she played a big role. Her head haunting Leao is what drove him crazy to the point where he admitted to police what he did. And then also, people in Taiwan think all those strange phone calls they were getting from that woman who was speaking Japanese and acting frantic and then hanging up, they say that was Mariko's spirit too, that was maybe one of her attempts just to keep people engaged with the story so that it wouldn't fade and become a cold case. And in fact, even some of the police, including Detective Lin, say they do believe Mariko's spirit played a role. And in fact, Detective Lin said at one point when he was inside of Leao's apartment, he was by himself and he felt someone push him on the back. And when he turned around, there was nobody there. And so he was convinced that Mariko's spirit was inhabiting that apartment. Podcast features 3 unique stories that all involve highway hazards. The audio from all of these stories has been pulled from our YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Bright Lights, and it's about an accident that has a major plot twist at the end. The second story you'll hear is called Random, and it's a story about 3 college students who are confronted with one of the most unlikely scenarios imaginable. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Goosebumps, and it is one of the most viral so-called glitch in the Matrix stories on Reddit. On Wednesday, April 26, 2006, a bright, beautiful, outgoing 18-year-old named Whitney Sarek began making her way across her campus towards her lecture hall where she had a class that morning. Whitney was a freshman at Taylor University, which is an evangelical Christian liberal arts college located in Upland, Indiana. Upland is a little town that sits about 2 miles east of Interstate 69 and is situated right between the 2 much larger cities of Indianapolis and Fort Wayne. As Whitney made her way along the pathway across campus and she passed by other throngs of students hustling to their own classes, she suddenly had a pang of anxiety as she realized the end of the school year was fast approaching. And while Whitney was definitely excited to head back home to rural Gaylord, Michigan, where she was from, to spend her summer vacation, she was also kind of bummed because she would have to say bye to all of her new friends in college that she wouldn't see again until after summer break in the fall when the next school year started. Whitney had made a ton of friends over the course of her freshman year, and by and large they were other freshmen like herself. But she did have a few friends that were upperclassmen. Because early in Whitney's collegiate career, she had discovered that upperclassmen were just as friendly as freshmen, and they came with the bonus of lots of experience and expertise, and if you just asked them for guidance or advice, they'd be happy to give it to you. And so over the course of the school year, anytime Whitney had an opportunity to interact with or be around upperclassmen, she would take it, thinking, maybe I can learn something. And in fact, that morning, as Whitney was making her way across campus, she saw a sign that was asking for students to volunteer to the next day head out to this banquet hall to set up this big banquet for the school's new incoming president. And so when Whitney walked over to the table and asked the people what this was all about, she would learn that the majority of the people that had signed up to be volunteers so far were upperclassmen. And so as soon as she heard that, Whitney was quick to write her name down as well. The rest of the day would go completely as normal for Whitney. She would go to her classes, she would study, she would meet up with friends, and then eventually in the evening, she would make her way back to her dorm room where she would go to sleep. Little did she know, when she put her head down on the pillow that night, she was within 24 hours of her life changing in the most drastic way imaginable.
The following morning, Whitney got up early, she took a shower, she brushed her teeth, and then she spent quite a while just staring at her wardrobe, debating which outfit she was going to wear, and then finally she chose the one she wanted and she got dressed. Whitney was not vain, but she knew the whole day would be spent around upperclassmen and university staff, and so she wanted to look her best. On her way towards her door to leave, Whitney would stop and look in her mirror one last time to make sure she looked okay, and in this fleeting moment, as she's looking herself up and down, she couldn't help but feel a justifiable sense of pride in this woman looking back at her. She had gotten into a great college, she had moved hundreds of miles from home and lived alone by herself for the first time, and her grades all year had been excellent. And so as Whitney's looking at herself, she thought to herself, you know what, I'm doing pretty good. Whitney's gaze would move from her reflection up to the clock on the wall, and she would see she was running late. And so she quickly grabbed her jacket, she threw it over her shoulder, and she went out the door. When Whitney arrived at the meeting spot in the parking lot nearby, she saw there was a group of what looked like students standing around a university van. And so Whitney walked up to them, and sure enough, this was the group of volunteers. It consisted of 7 other Taylor students, most of which were seniors, and 1 university staff member. And so Whitney didn't know any of them, and so she quickly introduced herself, everyone said hi, and then because Whitney was the last person they were waiting on, very quickly after she arrived, they were kind of ushered into the van, and then the van pulled out of the parking lot and began heading north towards Fort Wayne. Fort Wayne was where the banquet hall was. It was located about an hour north. At some point during this drive north, Whitney struck up a conversation with a 22-year-old senior named Laura Van Ryn, who was sitting right next to her. Whitney and Laura were total strangers, but they looked so similar physically. They were both tall, blonde, and very slim, that when they first got onto the van, one of the other volunteers actually asked them if they were related. But it wasn't just physical similarities that Laura and Whitney shared. Once they got to talking, Whitney would learn that Laura had also grown up in a small rural Michigan town. It was called Caledonia, and it was located only a couple of hours south of Gaylord, where Whitney had grown up. After the van finally arrived in Fort Wayne, the volunteers got out, they went inside of the banquet hall building, and for the next several hours, they set up tables and chairs, they put out silverware, they hung up decorations, and the whole time, Laura and Whitney just stayed close together, continuing their friendly banter. And then around 7 p.m., when the banquet hall was ready for the next day's ceremony, the volunteers decided their work was done, and so they left the banquet hall building, they piled back into the van, and began heading south back towards their campus. For the first few minutes of the ride, Laura and Whitney would just continue to chat with each other, but pretty quickly they, like the rest of the people in the volunteer group, just were tired from all the hard work of moving things around, and so they became quiet and began looking out the window, just kind of keeping to themselves. About 30 minutes later, when the van was within a couple of miles of their campus, Whitney would turn and look next to her at Laura just for a second, and right as she did, Laura would actually look up and look at Whitney. And so for a really quick second, they made eye contact, and so Whitney kind of awkwardly smiled at her. And as Laura was smiling back at Whitney, Whitney realized something very strange. There was this bright light on the side of Laura's face. And then seconds later, that bright light had grown, and the entire interior of the van was completely whited out. And then a second later, someone towards the front of the van yelled, "Oh my God, no!" And then the van went completely silent. Within minutes, dozens of 911 calls were coming in from motorists on I-69 saying that something terrible had happened. When first responders arrived on scene, they were braced for the worst, but even still, they were shocked at what they saw. Scattered all over the northbound and southbound lanes of I-69, not far from Taylor University, were all these huge chunks of jagged metal, there was glass everywhere, and there were bodies everywhere. That light that Whitney saw growing on Laura's face that suddenly filled the entirety of the van were the headlights of an 80,000-pound, fully loaded tractor-trailer truck driven by Robert Spencer. Robert was a truck driver, and he was traveling north on I-69 when he fell asleep at the wheel, at which point his truck veered off the road into the grassy median between the northbound side and the southbound side of I-69. His truck bounced up onto the southbound lane and crashed into Laura and Whitney's van, and when it did, the impact literally peeled off the side of their van and sent the van spinning. And so as the van is spinning, because of this huge opening in the side of it, the students inside were literally being violently thrown out of the van into traffic. When first responders finally actually began surveying the crash site, they would find Robert still in his truck, he was alive, but they would discover that of the 9 occupants inside of that van, 5 were deceased. A few hours later, in the early morning hours of April 27th, Whitney Sarik's family, back home in Gaylord, Michigan, woke up to the sound of a phone ringing. When one of Whitney's parents answered the phone, it was the Grant County coroner telling them their daughter had been in a terrible accident and she was deceased. At the same time, 3 hours south of Gaylord, Michigan, in Caledonia, Michigan, the Van Ryn family also was woken up in the middle of the night to a phone call, except the call they got was that their daughter Laura had been in that same crash, but she had survived, although she was in critical condition. In the days that followed, the Sarik family had Whitney's body transported to Gaylord, and then they began to plan for her funeral. A funeral that would have to be closed casket because of the extensive damage to Whitney's body. Meanwhile, Laura Van Ryn's family rushed to Parkview Hospital in Fort Wayne, and they would find their daughter bandaged head to toe with a neck brace on, laying in a hospital bed in a coma. Doctors would tell Laura's family that even though Laura was now stable, there was no way of knowing if she would ever come out of that coma. And even if she did, she had suffered a serious brain injury, which likely would impact her ability to function. And so knowing that at best this was going to be a very long road to recovery, Laura's family decided to move her from Fort Wayne back home to Michigan to a rehabilitation center in Grand Rapids that specialized in brain injury. And so while the Van Ryns were in the process of moving Laura back to Michigan, the Sariks were in the process of saying their final goodbyes to Whitney. On April 29th, so 3 days after the accident, the Sariks would hold a visitation in their hometown of Gaylord. A visitation is a time for friends and acquaintances to come together and pay respects and offer condolences to the people that the deceased have left behind. For Whitney's visitation, more than 1,400 people attended, which was nearly half of Gaylord's total population. The following day, on April 30th, Whitney was buried. At the same time, Laura's family, who had been taking turns keeping a 24-hour bedside vigil with Laura in the Grand Rapids facility, were given some incredible news. Based on brain scans, it looked very much like Laura would wake up from her coma, although there was no timeline. Over the next couple of weeks, Laura remained comatose, but her body would slowly begin to heal, and all signs seemed to be pointing towards her eventually making a recovery. And then on Tuesday, May 16th, so 20 days after the accident, Laura woke up from her coma. And amazingly, at first, it seemed like her brain was functioning the way it should be. The family could not believe their luck. This was a miracle. Over the next few days, Laura would slowly regain her strength to the point where she could move some limbs and she could sit up in her bed. And then as for her cognitive function, it seemed like she was making strides, but then she would do something that would make doctors and her family and everybody around her start to question if her brain really was okay. On Monday, May 22nd, so 1 week after Laura had woken up from her coma, she was sitting in her hospital bed with her physical therapist right next to her, and her family was in the room as well. And at some point, her physical therapist handed Laura a pencil, and then she put a pad of paper in front of her. And then the therapist told Laura to write a word down that was very specific. It was a word that Laura should know well, and a word that Laura should be able to spell. And so after Laura kind of gave a nod saying she understood the assignment, Laura took the pencil and very awkwardly and painstakingly wrote out a word. But when she was done and the therapist looked at what she had written, it was wrong. It didn't make any sense. And so she asked Laura to do it again. And so Laura, with even more determination, would try to write this word. And once again, she wrote the same word, the same incorrect word. And so it was at this point that the therapist and the onlooking family started to realize that, her injury to her brain might be more extensive than we thought. However, as everyone in that room would soon find out, that was not the case. There was something much, much bigger going on. Back on April 26th, just minutes after the car accident, first responders began moving about the crash site to figure out who was deceased and who was still alive. When they found Laura, she was barely clinging to life on the side of the road, and so they rushed over to her, they put her on a stretcher along with her purse, which contained her driver's license. They put that all together, they put her on an ambulance, and they sent her to the hospital. Once Laura arrived at the hospital, doctors would use her driver's license inside of her purse to identify her, and then they began wrapping her head to toe in bandages and casts. And when bandages began coming off over the following weeks, it was immediately obvious to everyone that this accident had significantly altered Laura's physical appearance, most notably her teeth. They almost looked like they had been shifted to one side in her mouth. However, to Laura's family, they didn't care how she looked. They only cared that she was still alive. But on Monday, May 22nd, when Laura was handed that piece of paper and a pencil, and she was told to write her name, she did not write L-A-U-R-A, Laura. She wrote W-H-I-T-N-E-Y, Whitney. It would turn out a colossal mistake was made, and nobody caught it until that moment. The woman sitting in the hospital bed with the pencil and paper was not 22-year-old Laura Van Ryn. The woman sitting in the hospital bed was 18-year-old Whitney Sarek. When Whitney was found on the side of the road clinging to life, the first responders thought the purse next to her was hers, and so they opened it up, they found a driver's license, they looked at it, and they looked at the victim on the ground, and they looked identical, and so they said, okay, this is Laura. And amazingly, Whitney's purse that contained her driver's license happened to land on the ground next to Laura's body. And so Laura was misidentified as Whitney Sarek. A week after Whitney had written her name down on that pad of paper, it was officially confirmed that this was a case of mistaken identity. And so once again, the Sarek family received a call in the middle of the night from the Grant County coroner. Except this time, they were telling them that your daughter did not die in that car accident. She's alive. She's in Grand Rapids waiting for you. And so the Sarek family, they were completely shocked. They wanted this to be true, but it just seemed too good to be true. They had had a funeral for Whitney. They had buried Whitney. Except, because it was closed casket, they never saw Whitney. And so the Sareks hopped in a plane, they flew to Grand Rapids, and they walked into that hospital room, and there on the hospital bed was their daughter Whitney with her arms outstretched, crying, calling for her parents. While this, of course, was a miracle for the Sareks, it was at the same time a complete nightmare for the Van Ryns. They had had their suspicions that something was off about their daughter, most notably her teeth, because they just didn't look like their daughter's teeth. But they had been told by the doctors and by anybody who would talk to them that it was perfectly normal for people involved in these very significant accidents to look completely different or even act completely different. And so the Van Ryns just kind of put their suspicions to the side and focused on looking after their child and helping her recover. A few days later, Laura Van Ryn's body, which had been buried in Gaylord, Michigan under the tombstone that said Whitney Sarek, was exhumed and her body was flown to Caledonia, where the Van Ryn family was able to give their daughter a proper funeral and burial. Even though Whitney and Laura had only known each other very briefly during that volunteer event in Fort Wayne, their families would forge a bond over this shared trauma. And in 2008, 2 years after the crash, the Sareks and the Van Ryns would co-author a book about their experience in going through this horrible event from each of their perspectives. That book is called Mistaken Identity: Two Families, One Survivor, Unwavering Hope. Also that year, on April 26th, so the second anniversary of the accident, Taylor University would dedicate a prayer chapel to the 5 victims. Since the crash, Indiana has changed their state's protocols and procedures for identifying accident victims to ensure this type of mix-up can never happen again. As for Robert Spencer, the truck driver who caused the fatal accident, he would be sentenced to 4 years in prison. Our next story is called Random. In 2019, Meg Maurer was a 21-year-old senior at Tulane University in New Orleans, Louisiana. She was studying ecology and evolutionary biology and planned to pursue a career in scientific illustration after graduation. This was a field that combined her skill as a scientist, her incredible artistic ability, and her general love of nature. But despite her intellectual brilliance, what Meg was actually known for was her very uplifting personality. When her mother was asked what her daughter was like, she said, "Well, it's like trying to describe what it's like to feel the warmth of the sun. There are not words to accurately describe what that feels like." And that was Meg. She was radiant, she was joyous, she was adventuresome, she was kind, she was really just a wonderful person to be around. In March of that year, just 2 months before their graduation, Meg and 2 of her close friends decided to go on a trip for spring break. This would be their last spring break as students, and they wanted to enjoy it. Because they were all in excellent physical condition, they decided they would spend the week hiking in Georgia. When Meg told her family about her big plans, they could tell she was extremely excited, and they just told her, be safe and we'll see you when you get back. On the morning of their departure, which was March 5th, Meg packed her suitcase into the trunk of her small green sedan, and then she drove over to her 2 friends' apartment building, and they came out and they put their suitcases into the car, and then once the car was all packed and all 3 of them were inside, they hit the road. The drive from Tulane University to this area in Georgia where they'd be hiking took about 8 hours if you didn't stop. But none of them were in a particularly big rush, and so they figured they would just stop along the way, and if they got to Georgia super late at night, so be it. After being on the road for 2 hours without stopping, they all needed to use the bathroom, and so Meg decided to pull over at the first rest stop she saw. And the first one she saw was in this residential town in Mississippi called Gaucher. So she pulls off the highway into this very nondescript rest stop, and all 3 of them get out. They go into the main building and they use the restroom. Meg was the first one to be done, so she came outside and she waited right near the bathroom door. And then her 2 friends, they finished up as well. They came out, and then the trio began walking back towards the parking lot where Meg's car was. At the same time, a man driving an 18-wheeler tractor-trailer truck was bombing down the highway right outside of this rest stop, and right before he was going to pass the area where this rest stop was, he heard something fall off the back of his truck. He instinctively checked both of his mirrors to see if maybe he could see what had fallen off, but he didn't see anything in the road, and so he just pulled over onto the shoulder and got out to see what was going on. When he walked towards the back of his truck, he expected to see, maybe one of the back doors had popped open or something like that. But even before he made it to the back of his truck and could even look at those back doors, he already knew what had fallen off the truck. 2 of his back tires were just gone. This truck had what's called dual rear wheels, which meant on the axle, there was not just 1 wheel on each side. Instead, there were 2 wheels on each side. So 4 wheels across 1 axle. And so each of these 2 wheels were bolted together and would turn at the same time and kind of functioned like 1 big fat tire. This gave the truck more stability and safety when it was towing. The driver, in a panic, looked back down the road in the direction he had just come, hoping to just see the tires somewhere, but they weren't anywhere to be found. And so, not really knowing what to do, he just instinctively called his boss and told him what was going on, and his boss just said, "Hold tight, I will send help out to you." And so this driver is left to just stand on the side of the road and wait for help to arrive. And so as he's doing that, he's just staring back down the road in the direction he had just come, as if these tires are just going to magically appear. And as he's looking in this direction, he starts to notice on the other side of the highway, there are police cars and ambulances streaming into a rest stop that he had just passed. And it was the rest stop where Meg and her 2 friends had been. It would turn out when these 2 tires became dislodged from this truck, they went careening across the highway to the other side, across oncoming traffic, all the way up into this rest stop, and they crashed directly into Meg right as she was climbing back into her car. These 2 tires combined weighed almost 1,000 pounds, and so the impact killed Meg. She was pronounced dead on the scene. After an investigation, it was not conclusively determined what actually caused these tires to fall off. The likely cause was they were missing a small part known as a locking washer that costs $3 and is very easy to acquire. But regardless, at this point, the incident is considered a freak accident. The next and final story of today's episode is called Goosebumps. In 2006, a 20-year-old woman named Sarah started having some very strange dreams about a woman named Aurora. She had a very striking face with sharp features and long black hair. Now, her dreams varied. Sometimes Sarah was in a crowd of people, or she was at her office, or she was just alone in a room. But in all of her dreams, Aurora would always show up. Either she would interact with Aurora and they would speak, but Sarah could never remember what they actually spoke about, or Aurora would just be in the crowd or in the background just watching Sarah. Now, she had these dreams enough that eventually Sarah began to think, I must know someone named Aurora. I must have come across this person, and now they're just kind of manifesting in my brain at night when I'm sleeping. And so she began going through her older posts on social media to look in pictures of her and of her friends to see if there was a woman with striking features and long black hair that was this Aurora person in her dream. But after looking through hundreds and hundreds of pictures, she couldn't find any indication that she had met this person, at least not according to her social media. And so Sarah began just going on Google and typing in, Aurora, long black hair, striking features. Has anybody dreamed about this? To see if there were people talking about having this type of dream on the internet. But she had no luck. Eventually, after about 3 or 4 months of having these strange dreams that Aurora was in, Aurora stopped showing up in Sarah's dreams. It was like it suddenly was all over. And so very quickly, Sarah just kind of forgot about it. A few years later, on Halloween night 2009, Sarah and a friend pulled off the highway into a gas station. They had been out with some friends celebrating Halloween, and now they were making their way back home. Sarah pulled into an empty spot right in front of the convenience store, and after they were parked, Sarah and her friend got out, they went inside, they got some snacks and drinks, and then they came back outside and climbed back into Sarah's car. A few moments later, Sarah had turned her car on, she had backed out, and she had driven past all of the gas station pumps, and she was making her way towards the single-lane strip of road that merged out onto the highway. It was how anybody who got into this gas station got back out onto the highway. And so as she's getting closer to the entrance of this short merge road, her phone suddenly rings. What happens next occurred over a span of just a few seconds. So it might seem like this is over several minutes, but this all happened pretty much simultaneously. So she's pulling up to the entrance of this merge road, her cell phone rings, and because there was no one behind her, it was not a busy night, Sarah decides to just stop her car, put it in park so she can safely take this phone call. And so she stops her car pretty much right in front of the entrance to this merge road, and she picks up her phone, she looks at the number, and she doesn't recognize it, but she picks it up anyways, and she says, hello. There was silence on her phone, and as Sarah is saying, hello, is anybody there? Another car from the gas station pulls up right behind Sarah's car, and they start honking their horn immediately. They're in a huge rush. And so Sarah, who's totally embarrassed that she's blocking traffic, she hangs up the phone, she puts it down, she puts her car back in drive, and she hits the gas. But this driver behind her is apparently in such a rush, they're so impatient, that they actually swerved around her, driving on the dirt off to the side of the road just to get around her, and then they sped off down the merge road back onto the highway. And literally, seconds later, another car that was already on the highway, a silver Honda Civic, lost control and smashed into this car that had just passed Sarah's car. So there's this huge car accident literally right in front of Sarah and her friend, who have now stopped the car. They're right at the end of the merge road looking at this horrible accident that they narrowly escaped. Sarah put her car back in park, she picked up her phone, and she called the police. When the police showed up a few moments later, they took down Sarah and her friend's version of events, and then a little while later, after the ambulances had left and after the 2 cars had been pulled off of the highway, one of the police officers pulled Sarah aside and told her that the driver of the Honda Civic and the driver of the car that had swerved around her had both been killed in the accident. Shocked, the only thing Sarah could think to do was to call back that number she didn't recognize that had effectively stopped her from getting onto the highway and maybe even stopped her from being hit by that Honda Civic. And so she wanted to talk to this person and thank them for saving her life. But when she called the number back, the person did not pick up. However, it went to her voicemail, and it said, "Hi, you've reached Aurora. Leave your name and number after the beep." Sarah could not believe it. She said she had never felt goosebumps like that in her entire life. The next day, Sarah tried calling the number again, and this time the woman, Aurora, answered the phone. The two got to talking, and Sarah explained her crazy dreams and now this crazy car crash thing and how it's all connected. And Aurora would tell Sarah, like, that's amazing. This is a crazy story you're telling me, except I didn't call you last night. I have no idea how you got my phone number. And so at the end of this phone call, the two women really had not reached any sort of explanation for how this came to be, how they came to be talking. But they ultimately just said, okay, hey, thanks and best of luck to you. And then they hung up. After the call was over, Sarah found herself just kind of sitting there, not really sure how to react to what had just happened. It was such a totally bizarre thing that she had just been through over the past 24 hours. And then if you include the dream, this has been a multi-year-long thing. And so on a whim, Sarah just opens up her Facebook account and she plugs in Aurora's full name because Aurora had given her full name on this phone call they had just had. And when she looked at her phone, when the results came in, Sarah nearly fainted. Right at the top of the results page was this woman, Aurora's Facebook account, and her profile picture showed her face. And when Sarah looked at her face, it was the exact same face she had seen so many times in her dreams. It was the same Aurora with the striking features and long black hair. The woman in her dreams was the woman who called her and saved her life. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please change the Amazon Music follow button's default internet browser to Microsoft Edge. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime, as well as the victims' families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com